right, gang, let's get started with this part of the abnormal or maladaptive behavior lecture. So, we're going to talk about psychopathology. And basically, what you're looking at when you're looking at psychopathology is inability to behave in ways that foster the well being of an individual and of the society. Basically, it's the way that you diagnose someone with any kind of psychopathology or any kind of disorder is that if it has to get in their way of their everyday lives, DUIs, if there's abuse in the home, the police are called in and they have to take them in. Things like that that come to attention because there are a lot of people out there who are living with diagnosable mental disorders and some type of psychopathology. They just it just has not come to the surface, and so this is one way is that if it gets in the way of your everyday life, then that would be considered a psychopathology or at least something that is diagnosable. Because there are a lot of functional alcoholics out there, for example, that are living their life, going to work, getting things done, but they're still alcoholics until either they lose their job, lose their family, lose their house, things of that nature because of the alcohol abuse or drug abuse, then it becomes an issue. Okay, so let's keep that in mind to start off with. Then you have models of abnormality. A couple of things here, the way that they look at abnormality. One model is a medical model. And that model, you are looking at what is something that is physiologically wrong. So a lot of people believe that it's the brain biology, and a lot of the mental disorders do have problems with the brain function, and that it would cause the abnormal behavior. And so we're looking at physiological problems, say like depression, and you have schizophrenia that has too much serotonin or dopamine in the system that it's not working as it should. If you remember when I talked about the brain being the hardware and then the mind being the processor or at least the program, and sometimes that program has a glitch in it. People who have OCD tend to have, it's like they say, it's like a glitch that's in the brain that causes them to wash their hands over and over again, circle their house or do things, touching things over and over again. A great movie or show to see is Monk. That's one of my favorites too because he does a really great job with showing what OCD. And there's another one too, movie that I like is with Jack Nicholson, As Good as It Gets. That's a great one too, as well. They don't want to step on a crack, a very, particular. So that's an extreme of the mental disorder. So medical model takes a look at physiologically if there's an issue. Psychoanalytic model, which comes from the Freudian and the Erickson, more Freudian. Erickson is more psychosocial, but he was a student of Freud. And that one takes a look at your childhood, that mental disorders or any kind of abnormality is caused by your past. That's why they ask the question, so what's your relationship with your mom like? Those type of thing, the Oedipus complex and so forth. So they want to look at the past, and those type of things affect your behavior, or they say that would cause some type of abnormality or abnormal behavior. Yeah, I had to cough there, so sorry about that. Kind of still clear my throat, still working on it, but it's going to be well in a little while, my hope is. Another model of looking at abnormality is behavioral model. So behavioral model goes back to Skinner. Skinner was, giving pigeons and training them. Some is Pavlovian too as well, Pavlov's dog, that we learn to behave a certain way because we get a reward. Okay, and so sometimes the abnormal behavior will occur because you get a reward. I always say that every behavior, remember, cognitive what thinking is covert behavior and any overt behavior. Any of those behaviors, thinking is a behavior. Every behavior has a purpose to it. If you didn't get anything out of it, you wouldn't do it. Okay, even negative behavior gets a reward of sorts. So that's why whenever a kid acts out, you don't want to give them the attention for the bad behavior. You want to give them attention for the good behavior. So people will learn to be abnormal or to do things that will cause people discomfort because they get a reward out of it. And some people stay sick because they get something out of it. I had a friend of mine who had her own private practice, and she said that she was working with a lady who was sick, and all of the family members were taking care of them, taking care of her, and she started getting better. And as she started getting better and doing things more, well, she didn't need any more as much help, so the family members went and did their own thing. So what do you think happened? She got sick again. So what it did, it caused them to come back and take care of her. So sometimes you'll even have parents who want their kids to be sick because it makes them feel important or makes them feel needed. I know it's kind of a crazy thought, but that's what it is. There's something that's called the Munchausen by proxy, which is where the mom will either like suffocate or try to injure the child in order for them to get attention from the doctors. Oh, my baby! Oh, look, my baby! But they actually did it, so it's Munchausen by proxy. Um, that's another disorder that comes from getting a reward. Then we're talking about the next one is the cognitive model. This one assumes that people's thoughts and beliefs are the main things. The way that they think is abnormal. The way that like to look at it, though, I like to look at it eclectically, which means a mixture of all of these things. You can have biological issues, which cause you to think differently, and then you have behavioral, that you've learned to behave a certain way, and those type of things. Another example of the behavior too is that you can learn to be OCD too if you have an OCD parent. You see that the way they clean, the way that that can affect your behavior, but also your thought process. Okay, so let's see what we got. Then you have the humanistic model, and that one is more of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and along those lines, specializes in people controlling control and responsibility of their own behaviors. This one takes more responsibility for what I do is my responsibility, not yours. Social cultural, it's shaped again by the family. So if you really take a look at it, all of these different ways of looking at abnormality, we're not just one way. We're not just the brain. We're not just social cultural model. We're not just humanistic. We're a mixture of those. So you have to look at a person and their behavior or abnormal behavior and why they're that way through different lenses or all of them together. Because you could have some people who are basically homeless, and it isn't because they chose to, but all those different things tended to work to either cause them to be homeless. So the big question was, are they homeless because they had a mental disorder, or did the mental disorder happen after they were homeless? Those type of questions are really interesting. So let's go on to the DSM. How do we diagnose? And this one is the diagnostic tool that is used, diagnostical and statistical manual. If you take a look at the very top one, I have the picture of the four of them. It's really interesting because can you see how small that one was? It was 1956, I think the first one came out in the 1960s, and then this is, I think, one of the first ones. But I was trained under the DSM-3 when I was in my master's program at UCLA, and to diagnose. And look at the difference. There's a difference between this, and why do you think that is? Do you think that because, well, between 1960 and when I was in school, 1986, 87, but there are a lot of more mental disorders that are out there? Well, not necessarily. Again, these are a group of psychiatrists who got together to try to get their area of expertise separate from medical doctors and clergy. Okay, so they wanted to have their own territory, so to speak, so they can't go to a doctor and get diagnosed as easily, or someone who's in the clergy, a priest or anybody else, they'd have to come to a psychiatrist. Okay, this is your diagnosis. Also, one of the other reasons why they put together the DSM was for insurance purposes, third party. So that way, when you have a diagnosis, they'll put the diagnosis down, and the insurance company says, well, we'll pay for that. Well, no, we're not going to pay for that. So a lot of times what ended up happening is there are some who will put a more severe diagnosis, like schizophrenia or psychotic episodes, things of that nature, when in fact that's not really what's happening, but they want to get paid. So it's third party payment. I mean, like I said, majority of the reason why they put together the DSM was so that professionals who were working with people in the mental health area could have the same language. So, as I said before, when you are looking at someone who's schizophrenic, you want to know what schizophrenic means, and we see and talk about the same thing. Things have changed throughout the time, as I said before. Homosexuality was considered a mental disorder before, and then politically it changed. It's no longer there as a mental disorder. Uh, And then schizophrenia has changed, where before schizophrenia was like a split in personality. That's changed. Now, personality disorders or multiple personality disorders is its own category. So it's a really interesting dynamic that goes through when you're talking about mental disorders or the DSM. Now it's a DSM 5, and this is TR, and now look how thick it is. It's just amazing. And and basically, what ends up happening is that it's the medicalization of behavior, because anything you can consider to be a mental disorder. When I used to teach abnormal psychology class, specifically, I had people create their own mental disorder based upon things that they saw in everyday life. And then, for example, one girl created a usually it hits men ages 20 to 25 or 20 to 30, and it's called fear of commitment syndrome. So those type of things, anything can be considered a mental disorder if you just describe it and see it as abnormal. So be careful out there if you have some commitment issues. So let's go through, continue on. Dun-dun. So classifying it again, this is the DSM-5, and this is what help clarify discussions and also treatments and so forth. It doesn't really talk about treatments as much, but it at least gives you a breakdown of how to diagnose whether somebody has this disorder or not. 5 axes and design primary to descriptive suggests that underlying causes of individual behavior and problems that are there. So that's the key thing that they take a look at in order to diagnose a mental disorder. Okay. So now let's take a little overview of the mental disorders in general. So you have psychotic disorders that are one of the most severe. And now understand, mental disorders are basically on a spectrum. So you can have very severe over on the right hand side, to use the left, to me right hand side, and then left hand side. But most of us are in the middle and balanced, okay? So you can have somebody who is depressed, for example. Everybody goes through depression. Everybody feels sad every once in a while. But when it becomes something that affects their everyday life and they can't get out of bed, or they don't have any energy for anything, or they become suicidal, the further you get to the far right there on the right side of the bell curve, then you're going into some psychotic episodes. So you can have depression, major depression, minor depression, but you can have major depression with psychotic episode. So in other words, somebody who's having some type of hallucinations or delusions because they're depressed. Okay, so and that's what you're kind of trying to figure out with their background. Often leads to hospitalization. And if somebody has psychosis, you can even have schizophrenia. Someone who's on medication, or they stop taking the medication, they'll have hearing voices, and you start to have hallucinations, have delusions. Those would be psychotic episodes. Then you also have organic mental disorders. Hold on. So you have organic mental disorders, and these are basically like senility, some drug damage, alcoholism. If you're drinking too much, it'll again affect your brain. Diseases of the brain, injuries, poisons of sorts. So this would be more of the organic mental. So these would be looking at loss of memory, someone who has senility, someone who has Alzheimer's disease. Those would tie into the organic disorders. Psychoactive substance abuse or use disorder, marijuana, amphetamines, all of these things, alcohol can be, again, you can diagnose them with this diagnosis. These usually have, again, cultural or not cultural, but social and occupational functioning. As I said before, a disorder isn't, there's a lot of undiagnosed disorders out there, people walking around with undiagnosed mental disorders. It only becomes quote unquote a mental disorder if it gets in the way of your everyday living, and then you're either taken in by police officers and so forth. Okay, let's talk about mood disorders. Mood disorders are really interesting. Those are your depression, your bipolar kind of manic-y, you know, hyperactivity, which is kind of interesting because as a confession on my side of it, that when I was younger, I was diagnosed with hyperactivity attention deficit disorder. So I was given Ritalin when I was younger. My mom said, "No, you know what? You're not gonna take that." I was active, you know, and then I come to realize too, it's kind of a self confession, or really realizing that I, have that ADD. I'm not to the point where, as I said, there's a spectrum. I'm not at the point of having to have any medication, but I recognize my mind jumping quick, squirrel, that type of thing. And, there are other people who are even more severe who need that medication because biologically or something going on that they need to slow down. So Ritalin is really, actually, it's interesting because Ritalin is really just speed. So someone who doesn't have hyperactivity attention deficit, the speed will calm them down. Or no, someone who does not have it, the Ritalin will be like speed, the drug speed kind of thing that kind of gets you going. And then for someone who has attention deficit disorder, it will calm you down. Sometimes caffeine will do that, I believe, with people who have hyperactivity attention deficit. It calms them down. When other people, it would speed them up. It would give them more energy. We're all different. This is what's so cool about it. We're all different and unique. You can't have one type of system or one type of treatment for that'll blanket everyone, and then everybody. We're so unique and different. That's what makes us really cool, is that we are. And it makes it fascinating because there can be different variables that you don't realize that are tying into their behavior. Okay, so you got to take each person as they are and see the uniqueness with them, even in mental illnesses. Okay, so let's continue on. Excuse me. All right, let's talk about post-traumatic stress disorder. This one is an interesting one because when you look at, I'm letting it load up here, see how this pans out. So, post-traumatic stress disorder this is fascinating because I had a student once who had come back from, it was actually the Iraq War, um, and he would sit in the back of the classroom. And we were talking one time, and he was saying, when I was talking about post traumatic stress disorder, he was saying that he has to sit in the back where he could see everything because when they were there, they never knew what was going to happen. They were always on edge. He would say that any kind of bush that he walks by, he's always looking around. Okay, because it was fight or flight. Fight or flight system kicks in your body. It's where your autonomic nervous system and your parasympathetic nervous system, start to get ready to go, ready to fight. There's sympathetic, parasympathetic. So what happens is that it's a fight or flight syndrome that it's heightened and it stays up there like this. Um, Another way of looking at it too, I worked with when I was working in East LA as a therapist as part of my internship. I worked with a group of adult children of alcoholics, and it was fascinating to listen to their stories because they said that their parents were alcoholics and they were always walking on eggshells. And it was one of these things. I go, what do you mean by walking on eggshells? And they said you never knew whether they're going to be a nice drunk or a mean drunk. So as soon as they heard the parent coming home, that again, fight or flight start to kick in. You start to, okay, what's going to go on with it? A lot of them, if you want to make sure that you're quiet and you don't do anything to upset, you don't know what kind of, what the alcohol is going to do to them. So they live this way and grew up this way. So they have these defense mechanisms, and it's still PTSD. And it's really interesting when you talk to people who have the PTSD and have gone through it. It's like going back to that if they're in battle and they actually see it, it's more severe. Rape could be another way, and I have a video here that kind of describes it a little bit from the different areas. But the body still responds to it. You are reliving it again. It's a post-traumatic stress disorders, and so you're constantly, as you start fireworks, 4th of July for a lot of military, especially when they came back from war, the bang, boom, 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 again, boom. So all of a sudden you're flashed back into wherever you started. That was sound was familiar, whether you were in combat or not. So when you're looking at post-traumatic stress disorder, then it's a really interesting process that the people go through. All right, let's take a look at this video here that I found this on YouTube. In its different types of traumas create different types of PTSD. So it's really interesting.
I think PTSD is PTSD, whether it's caused by a rape or the death of your friend in front of you or the car crash in which you were narrowly missed, but you saw your husband struck by a truck and killed. I mean, these are my PTSD patients. I'm dealing with all of them now. To me, the PTSD is PTSD. The quality of the PTSD may be different. I mean, think of having a traumatic amputation. Your leg is suddenly not there. It's different for every person who goes through it. And from a surgeon's point of view, it's a traumatic amputation. You have to deal with it. Even from a surgeon's point of view, these are different, depending on where they happen and what kind of shape somebody is in. But to me, PTSD is an injury. It wasn't there before you were traumatized. After you were traumatized, you have a syndrome. You have a trauma memory that comes back and haunts you. You have a reduced ability to have all the human feelings and all the human desires that you used to have, and you're very nervous. I think we're past thinking of it as some extreme of anxiety. It's a medical situation as a result of an injurious exposure to something that was too much, too much sound and it ruptured your eardrum, too much shock and it ruptured your spleen, too much of this kind of imagery, and it changes something in the physiology of your brain. And it gets better. It gets better through time. Well, feeling the opposite of hopeful about the future is part of the diagnosis of PTSD. We know that when your brain has been overwhelmed, it's not just that something bad happened. It's that the PTSD injury happened as well. that brings with it a sense of a foreshortened future, or a future that won't be as good as it could have been or should have been, or that other people will have. Yes, that's part of what happens to the traumatized mind. And I think it's part of us, whether we're therapists or whether we're other fellow travelers on this road, to remind everybody out there that's part of the illness, or it's part of the injury. That part gets better and everything else gets better. Now to feel worthless on top of it, to feel I am just not a good person, that's not really in the PTSD description, but it's in the depression description. If given everything that you're going through and that you've gone through, you feel like a worthless human being, the odds are you're depressed. And that is another condition of the mind, depression. And there's help for depression. There is cognitive behavioral therapy. In the worst case, there's inpatient therapy. You may need to be in a place that is protected, where you don't have to decide what to buy for dinner or care for somebody else. It's your turn to be cared for if the depression is that bad. And there are people who are depressed and suicidal and can't fend for themselves. That's an extreme. So there are remedies for that. There's protection. There's coaching.
I love that because he makes a good point that when you can have a diagnosis of PTSD, but you can also have depression on there. So there's a mixture of different things. I mean, there's the axis 1, axis 2. You don't need to know about that right now, at least, where they go. But you can have the most severe, which could be, post-traumatic stress disorder, but you can have depression and then some other symptoms along with. So it's not black and white. It's not, oh, this is what it is and this is what it's going to be. No, as I said before, each person is unique. Each person's situation is unique. And from there, you try to make the best diagnosis as you possibly can. Okay. Now, I wanted to bring this up too, because we're talking about, how has COVID affected you? And I found this recently, which she's from New Zealand. New Zealand was even locked down even more than we were, and apparently there might be going back into that. But there were a lot of depression. There's a lot of issues that came out of being locked down that people don't realize. Even the face mask too, where especially kids have changed. There's been studies that are starting to come out on how that affects kids' development, because we need to see our faces. We need that. We're social animals. We react off of each other. It's very important to do that. But being locked down too. She gives a really good description here, and also she gives some suggestions, which is really a good way of dealing with it. But you don't really think about COVID lockdown or going through COVID or any of these other things as being post-traumatic stress disorder. But take a listen and tell me what you think.
Hello again. It's been a few days since I did one of my little videos, and I'm out walking and I felt inspired. And what I want to share today is what I could call trauma recovery. And this is in the context of when we get let out of lockdown. So the day after we were allowed to be let out of lockdown, I really felt like one could use an analogy of what it's like when an animal has been traumatized and it's being reorientated back into life. And I felt a little like this is how us humans may be feeling as we come out of lockdown. And I'll share why and why I think this. The picture or the memory that came to me that day was from the previous lockdown a year before, where I'd been fostering a cat, or a kitten actually, and this kitten came to me from some sort of very traumatic life experience. I don't know what it was, but it was traumatized. And So as soon as I got it, and I put it in the bathroom, put it in there for a few hours, and then I opened the door, and it was hiding under a bench sort of that I had, quite a low bench, and it simply wouldn't come out. And I would put food in there, but it simply would not come out for several days. And the reason for this is because it was afraid, it was frightened, and it was protecting itself and feeling very, very, what's the word, very sensitive, I guess, very cautious. And gradually, over a period of a few more days and a couple of weeks, it started to venture out, and it would come out into the living room, but then it would run away from me and run back into its safe hiding space.
Okay, this made me think. How many of you or know someone who's felt like the little kitten? Okay, and then the rest of that she describes coming up. So we don't take into consideration that being locked down too. It's sensory deprivation is what that's called in psychology, and you're depriving people. That's what solitary confinement is in prison, and it's trying to get back into the swing of things. So continue to listen to it.
But gradually, over a period of a month or so, it started to have more courage, and it came out, and it stayed longer in the living room, and then it started approaching me, and then it started letting me pat it and stroke it. And by the time it had been with me for a couple of months, it was a completely different cat. Although, having said that, it still had the trauma embedded in at a cellular level. So this comes to what I want to talk about how some people may be feeling now as they're let out of lockdown in New Zealand the second time, and actually for some people the third time. Because the image that came to me on the day that we were finally allowed to legally come out of our houses was a bit like opening the front door and stepping out with extreme caution and trepidation, and a feeling of like, ooh, am I allowed to put my foot outside my front door? Is it safe to do that? And doesn't that feel like a strange feeling? And even though we've been allowed to go out, to go for walks and go to the shops, it was still a different feeling of actually being allowed out to go and do one's normal business almost. And I just wonder how many people may be feeling a similar thing, that as we come out of lockdown here, there's still this slight sense of trepidation, because we've been so used to being told that we can't go out, and secondly, there's this lingering, lurking thought of how long will this last, and maybe this is going to happen again, and therefore I shouldn't get my hopes up too much about getting back to a normal life. So we're constantly in this fear response. We're constantly walking on eggshells, which is a very typical response for the body to be in, any human person's body to be in when they don't feel safe. And this is very common, for example, when children grow up in an abusive environment, physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, psychological abuse. When we grow up in that sort of environment, we never feel safe, and so our stress response gets constantly set to on. The switch is just on all the time.
That is a great description. And again, as I said, the fight or flight, it's always on. Great description.
And with all the clients that I've worked with over many, many years, helping them to recover from chronic illness, when we dig down, what we find is that their stress response, their sympathetic nervous system response, SNS, or as I like to call SOS, is constantly switched on and has been switched on for many, many years. And because it's been on for so many years, it's become an unconscious response.
Yep.
So I think it's really interesting in the context of what is happening at the moment that this may be going on for quite a few people, because it has been a traumatizing event, what we have been going through the past 18 months from many different aspects. It's traumatizing to maybe not have our income. It's traumatizing if, for example, we need medical help and we can't get it because of restrictions on being able to see the therapist that we might normally want to see. And that, dentists, for example, the number of people that may have dental pain or back pain and they can't get to see the health professionals that they would normally see. It's traumatizing for people locked up in houses with abusive situations, and it's traumatizing being locked up, full stop.
Yep.
And remember that the term lockdown is a prison term.
Yep.
Yeah, so it is just plain traumatizing for the human body to be locked up.
And the human mind.
I mentioned in another video, I can't remember which one it was, that years ago on a training that I was doing, we were told about an experiment that was done with rats where they were pinned to a board, which sounds really horrible, I know, but they were pinned to a board and they wanted to see which would create more trauma, that or not having food and water. And they found that not being able to escape was more traumatizing than having food and water. So being locked up and having the fear factor constantly drilled into us if we're watching the mainstream television, which is all about fear and drama, is very traumatizing. And if people are watching the TV and the news over and over again, watching those ads, which I don't watch the TV, but I hear people talking about them, watching the ads and then the music with the ads that comes on, it keeps re-triggering, like PTSD.
Exactly.
It keeps re-triggering fear and trauma. So we're getting trained or entrained, just like Pavlov's dogs in his experiment. Pavlov, he trained dogs when they were in the stress response, and he noticed that they were much easier to train when they were in the stress response. But the point is that we get entrained into this fear stress response, and then we're afraid to have our freedom again. We're afraid to go out into the free world, so to speak, and to live our lives freely, because we're afraid that that freedom may be taken away.
Okay, this made me think about have you ever heard of, the question, how do you train a flea? Okay. Now, the fleas that get on dogs, they're bing, bing, bing. They're always jumping, they're jumping, jumping, jumping. Small little bitty things, right? Fleas. How do you train a flea? Well, what you do is you put them in a box, put the top on top of the box. So when they jump, they're constantly hitting their head, kind of hitting up against the box, right? Eventually, they'll get tired or just realize, I'm not going to jump anymore. So they are trained not to jump. Same thing here. By locking down, again, you get trained to comply, or to you lose a lot of your will. Another example I just thought of too is elephants for circus, when they used to have circuses and stuff like that. How do they train a baby elephant? Well, they put a chain connected to one of their feet, so they can only go so far. If you leave it on long enough, what ends up happening is that you're like, well, I guess I can't go. It's learned helplessness is what that's called. Okay. So once they take it off after a number of years, the elephant isn't going to run, because they've tried so much and they've learned to be helpless. That's the thing you got to be very careful of these, lockdowns. I'll let her continue. It's excellent.
At any moment. So if you feel a bit like a traumatized cat that is slowly being able to be let out of its cage, it's not surprising. So the first thing is to recognize what is happening, recognize that there is this trauma response going on, and it's personal and it's collective. And then do whatever you can to bring yourself out of that stress response. And there are many ways of doing that. Meditation, qigong, going out in nature is so important. I go out every day. I make myself go out every day. I shouldn't have to make myself, but you know, we do. So every day, fresh air, sunshine, doing healthy things for ourselves, getting away from our computers, putting the cell phones down, putting the computers down, definitely not watching mainstream television.
Amen.
Definitely not watching mainstream news.
Amen.
We need to do whatever we need to do to calm our nervous system, to bring ourselves back into our natural state of calm and relaxation. So I hope this has been a useful little video.
Yes,
I
it
hope that
has.
wherever you are, you're doing really well, and see you again.
All right. I love that, what she was talking about. And, you know, you really think about those people. I did in my TEDx talk there at CAC when I talked about energy vampires, and I talked about how the media uses, you know, if it bleeds, it leads. And so all they are is trying to get your fear up. And if they are able to get your fear up, then they're able to control you. Okay, as I said before, if I know what your fear is, you're mine. I can control your emotions. And you know, the thing about it is, you think about people who are fearful. That's the fight or flight response. And if they can control that, they can control you. And I just want you guys to be aware of the things that are out there, and be careful, because you don't want their fear monkeys to jump on your fear monkeys and everybody's kind of, you know, get all fearful, because fear is false evidence appearing real. Okay, but again, there's sometimes that you know, fear is helpful when you're, you know, up very high, and you're, you know, I have a fear of heights. You know, if I'm on a roller coaster, you know, or I'm on a high, very high on the roof here too, I kind of get that vertigo kind of look. But that's logical. That's logical. But a lot of the things that are in the media, they want to make you fearful. I saw this one video of once COVID first came out. It's like, oh no, there's COVID. Oh no, there's COVID over here. Oh my god, I got COVID. Oh, God. You know, people will get sucked into that, and their mind will start to go into that. And especially if they already had OCD or a disorder, lockdowns did help some people, I guess. I mean, the people who were introverts, you know, for me, I'm like, okay, this is cool, but eventually you end up needing to go out. Think about any of you who lived in, I'm from Arizona, so I don't know what snow days or snow where you have to get, you're stuck in house during the winter, but they can, you know, people kind of go little cabin fever, they call it, if they're pretty much locked down by the weather. So, again, it has that type of psychological effect on your person and your fight or flight. So please be careful out there, and please stop watching mainstream media, seriously, because that's all it is dun dun dun. And today, this is what happened, and they repeat it over and over and over again. You go to one, they'll repeat the same thing over here. "Hey, this is today. There's how many people have died, and you know there's an accident." Negativity. Why? Okay. Again, sorry. That's one of the things. If you want to protect your own psychological and emotional um, well-being, stop watching mainstream media, especially CNN. You know, again, they were caught lying a whole bunch of times. Anyway, I'm gonna get on my soapbox, but you know, again, we don't watch the news. Anytime, any kind of news, any kind of, you know, pharmaceutical, any kind of commercial, we don't watch TV as much anymore, because again, all it is negative, and it brings you down. It's not worth it. So, okay, I'm going to end here on this one. And if you have any questions, please comment below and tell me what you think about the video. Subscribe to if you want. I guess I'm trying to figure out where I'm putting this, but it's for my Psych 101 class. And I'll continue on with the next one. So this is number 2. And then the third one, I believe I'm going to be getting into the severe mental disorders and then show you some examples of that. So hopefully you enjoyed this, and you guys have a great one. Talk to you later. Ciao.